Well, Nicolás Maduro, president of the country of Venezuela, is now in U.S. custody as a result of a middle of the night raid. But was it legal? Let's break that down. Hi, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and I'm here with the amazing Kelly Hyman, and we are going to get into what happened here and if this even remotely passes muster under international law. Now, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe Legal AF for all of the deets at the intersection of law and politics. So, Kelly, this midnight raid in the middle of the night, Nicolás Maduro, his wife, snatched up by U.S. forces, brought to the U.S., is now facing trial in the state of New York, being tried by the federal government for narco-terrorism and other charges. Was this action remotely legal? What do you think?
There is two schools of thought. One is, in fact, that it was legal. Other schools of thought it wasn't legal. Now, the argument for it was legal, one of the arguments was that there is a pending indictment. And so based on the indictment, that it was an endeavor because of that. And based on the indictment, that they had authority to do that. Now, the counter argument to that is that an act of war is something that only Congress has the power to do. The counter argument wasn't in fact a war, but in fact there are certain procedures in place based on UN. The counter argument why it wasn't legal and based on those requirements, it did not meet those requirements. Now, the counter argument to that is, yes, it was self-defense. And so in self-defense, it could do that. But depending on what school of thought, some people think that absolutely 100% it's not legal, where the counter argument was, in fact, yes, it is legal. What do you think?
Well, you already know what's about to happen. I'm coming down hard on the side that was illegal as all get out. So first off, there's this thing called the UN, the United Nations, right? They have a Security Council. So when a country is like, listen, I'm being violated by this other country, we've got an issue, you go to the UN Security Council. They give authorization, and then you have a joint force that goes in to try and potentially get this person. I mean, I'm oversimplifying. There's a lot more that has to happen in between, but there's still a process set forth by the UN Security Council to deal with conflicts between countries. The US blew right on past that and ignored it. Now, another pathway that could have made this legal was that if the Venezuelan government agreed, like, listen, hey, come get this guy because he's a problem, right? Well, here's the issue. The government is kind of like, who's the legitimate president, right? Because there was a debate as to whether or not Nicolás Maduro was, rightfully elected. And if that's the case, and if he was not rightfully elected, right, this was not a fair and free election, then who would be the one to give the consent? Because it couldn't be the government that was, quote unquote, illegitimately there. So there's no one to give consent. So that kind of goes out the window, right? So you've got that. Now, the whole self-defense aspect. We're not at war with Venezuela. Like, did they attack anything of ours? Did they blow up a ship? Did they, kidnap somebody? Like, and I'm talking government sanction. I'm not saying like random trafficker A, sells drugs. No, I'm talking, did the country of Venezuela attack our interest? Was it another Pearl Harbor? Was it another 9/11? What are we defending against? Because if you're saying the argument is we're acting in self-defense because they're narco-terrorists, well, that argument could be used for a whole lot of countries. And so now does that give the justification for the U.S. to go into Mexico and take Mexico's president because the Sinaloa cartel happens to be running wild there, right? Despite the president's efforts the president of Mexico's efforts to try and address it. Does that mean go after the president of Colombia, even though the U.S. and Colombia have been working for decades together to try to eradicate narco-terrorism? So, the self-defense argument falls flat there as well. And then from the perspective of, this was a law enforcement action. Okay, cute. But that's what the 1973 War Powers Act was for. You got to go to Congress if you're going to take that kind of action, be like, hey, we need to get this guy because he's causing this much damage, et cetera, et cetera. And also, if it's a law enforcement action is like, maybe 10 dudes roll up, with guns and do whatever. 15,000 soldiers were sent to Venezuela. That's not a law enforcement action anymore. Imagine 15,000 cops showing up at somebody's door saying, oh, I'm executing a warrant. SWAT doesn't even come that deep. You know what I mean? So the math is not mathing here at all. And I just think that this administration is twisting themselves sideways for the purposes of regime change. And is it for humanitarian reasons? There's an argument to be made that it's not. But there's also something to note that Venezuela has a lot of oil. And Chevron right now is the only, really big, U.S., oil gas producer that's working there. But Exxon is over here like, hi. So I feel like there's more to this story. And it's not just about, listen, it's law and order. We're trying to bring this narco terrorist to justice. Because if that's really what it was about, there's a whole lot of other folks that you can arrest that would give you the information to be able to effectively prosecute Nicolás Maduro. And we talked about the indictment and in another video, encourage y'all to check that out. But, the reality is the indictment kind of thin from my perspective. So what's really the motivation here? And why couldn't you just do this the proper legal way? Go to the UN, go to Congress, be transparent about where we're going, why we're going, and what the evidence is to show that this person is such a danger. But maybe it's just me.
Well, the counter argument is remember years back in regards to Noriega and what happened with the court cases that went with the position that, in fact, it was legal. So the counter argument can be made that based on that legal case, that in fact it was legal. What do you think?
Well, here's the issue with Noriega, because, okay, I'm not going to tell my age, but I remember the invasion well because I always reference this a lot. I grew up in a Caribbean household, Panama being very close to, countries of my descent. This was something that was on Caribbean talk radio like nonstop. So it was in the backdrop of me growing up. And the thing that folks forget is that people were really mad at Bush for doing that. Like it damaged international relationships with a number of countries because they thought that was an illegal invasion. And it was the same thing. Bush didn't go to the UN. He ain't go to Congress. He just went and acted. And there was a lot of fallout from that. Now, again, Noriega convicted, yada, yada. Okay, fine. But the process was wrong. And just because it, quote unquote, worked out well, doesn't mean that we repeat the same flawed process, right? Because again, Panama, smaller country, what was at stake? Access to the canal. So again, follow the money, right? So there's always something like that involved. But Panama is a much smaller country. Venezuela is a huge country has deep infrastructure problems, right? You have the people who have been oppressed, human rights issues. I mean, you have so much going on, separate and distinct from any kind of drug trafficking. So now what? We're going to do the Iraq and Afghanistan thing and just hang out there for the next 20 years and then have to messily extract ourselves because there was no plan as to what to do next, right? So, Panama is not an apples to apples to me, an apples to apples comparison because smaller country, much more of a U.S. sphere of influence. We have a base there, way different than Venezuela, which is a huge country. You've got warring factions in terms, not warring as in literally, but different factions who are going to want to claim the presidency versus in Panama, there was a little bit more of a cleaner transition, sort of like, all right, we already know who's going to take over. But in Venezuela, you got the vice president, you got Maria Machado over here getting with her Nobel Peace Prize, talking about I should be president. You've got, the gentleman, Edmundo Gonzalez, who had purportedly won the election, but Maduro took over anyway. So you have so many people in the mix talking about, oh, I should be president. How is that going to be all figured out unless you do free and fair elections? And is Venezuela even in a position to be able to do that now or anytime soon? I don't know. I got questions.
To give a sense of the size of Venezuela, it is bigger than California. So just imagine that and the potential chaos, as you pointed out, with the different people stepping up and saying that, in fact, I should be president or I am president. How this all plays out is going to be a continuing conversation because each day we get new information and new insight of what's going on, what's happening, and what's to come.
And trust and believe, we will be here on Legal AF to give you all the details as we learn more, as things shift, as things change, as more evidence, I hope, comes out, more transparency. Big fan of that. So Kelly and I will be back. I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva. That's Kelly Hyman. And thank you for tuning in. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Legal AF. Because, we're going to stay busy for these next few months. I can feel it already.